Starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Emily Ruffle and I'm the Marketing Assistant at DSDM Consortium. Thank you all for joining us today for our first DSDM webinar, which Keith will be talking about MoSCoW Prioritisation. The slides and recording from today's webinar will be available from our website, dsdm.org. Click on the Dig Deeper tab, then click on Webinar Library. I'm shortly going to pass you over to your presenter, Keith Richards, but just a couple of things before I do. Today's hashtag to tweet about our webinar will be #musthaves. I'd also like to point out a couple of features of the control panel. Just in case this is your first time using the software, if you look at the top right hand side of your screen, you'll see an orange box with a white arrow. Click on this to maximise or minimise your control panel. If you'd like to ask a question, just type your question into the question box and Keith will take as many as he can at the end. One of the new functions of this software is that we can now see Keith's webcam. You have control of how big or small you want Keith's picture. Just click and drag the double lines till you're happy with how he looks. If you're watching the recording, don't worry, there's nothing wrong with your screen. You can only see Keith's webcam if you're watching this live. So without further ado, I'll pass you over to your presenter, Keith Richards.
Thank you very much, Emily. That's excellent, and welcome everyone to a combined webinar. It's a DSDM and a KRC webinar, and we thank you very much for DSDM for asking us to come and talk through some things, and we're going to be talking about mastering the art of MoSCoW prioritization. And we're going to go a bit further than just the headline, must, should, could. We're going to try and go as far as we can and tell you lots of tips and tricks to get this thing to actually work in the real world. We've been looking at some of the people from registering and attending, and it's across the globe. It's all over the world. We've got Canada, India, Australia. We've got people from Latin America, lots of people in Europe, and lots of people in the UK. So it's been a fantastic turnout. Any unusual ones we spotted? The only one we spotted really that I don't think we've seen before is Trinidad and Tobago. So I believe it might be quite early over there. So I hope you enjoy the webinar. I do want to give a name check just very briefly to a couple of people. We've got someone on the webinar who's listening called Di Clegg, and he's a very special person because he actually invented MoSCoW, so I believe, many moons ago when working back for Oracle in the 90s. So hope you enjoy what you're going to hear there, Di, and if I get anything wrong, please let us know. So without any further ado, let's get going and go through the webinar. The headline here is about protecting quality and making sure you sort of deliver something on time. And I just want you to look at those two words, quality on time, because this is at the essence of what prioritization is all about. It's very important that you don't see prioritization as if you like, the end, or MoSCoW and working in a MoSCoW way is the whole point. It's actually trying to get you somewhere, and what it's trying to get you to is to hit deadlines and make sure that you've actually got the quality level is maintained. So I'll explain how we do that as we go through. So let's get on with the first slide. Just an idea of where we're going. I'm going to give you some basics, but that'll only be the first sort of 5 or 10 minutes. We then need to get into the juicy bits and have a look at how this works, and we're talking about different levels, sort of real-world context. And I'll show you some more advanced tips, which I'm hoping that some of those used to MoSCoW will actually benefit from as well. Now at the end we'll have 10 minutes of questions and answers, so make sure you get your questions ready a bit nearer time. But in terms of where we're going on the presentation, that's where we'll be going. Now many of you are used to our webinars from a KRC point of view. This is a DSDM one, so I'm going to go very light on the commercials, and really it's just to say some of my experience there in terms of Scrum, DSDM, Agile, and very familiar with all the Agile approaches. And one of the things I'm going to play around with on this webinar is the different prioritization styles that you might find, for example, in Scrum compared to, say, in a method like DSDM. A lot of people are not keen on MoSCoW, to be honest with you, and a lot of people don't get it. And what I'm going to try and do in this webinar is explain why it is quite powerful, because I'm very passionate about it. I think it's a brilliant technique, but you can't use it everywhere, and I'll explain that in due course. Now the first thing I want to get going with is to cover a little bit of the basics, and some of you may be familiar with this picture. It's called the two triangles. It's straight out of the, if you like, the DSDM handbook. And on first look, it's reasonably straightforward. Okay, traditionally we set the scope in stone, if you like, and with the more agile and DSDM approaches, we don't. We vary the scope. We play with the features. But I just want to sort of dwell on this for a few minutes because it's more complicated and in a sense more profound than that. The reason we're fixing time is because in this day and age, and we're in 2014 now, you know, we've got Amazon, Facebook, Google. A lot of things we work on is very much time focused. People want it now. They just want to pick up an app. They want to click on something. People are very much demanding in terms of time. I know at KRC we get a lot of customers, and the sort of common expression is time to market. They want something that's going to help with time to market, and this is where approaches. We've had to rig up something, by the way. So normally we'd go with KRC livery, but here we're going with something a bit more low tech, and my glamorous assistant is now sorting this out. So if you can keep focused on what I was trying to say there, just going to need to hold that for about 40 minutes, Marie. So the point about time and cost is that if we try and hit deadlines, we get massive benefits from actually using concentrating on time. So the upsides are that we can plan, we can hit deadlines, we can hit market opportunities, we can cap cost. The upside of working in a sort of time-focused way is enormous. But in order to do that, we have to prioritize. We're not too bothered about cost. We are a little bit, but really we'd rather hit the deadline and maybe go 5% over on the budget rather than be late and miss a market opportunity. Another important thing is this idea of protecting quality. It's very important that we test things well, we design things well, we document things well. And this is why we can prioritize to ensure that we keep the quality threshold at the right level. So again, don't just see this as, hey, we play with features with Agile and we don't with traditional approaches. It's really what are the upsides we're getting, and it's this time and quality is what we're trying to achieve. And you can't have both. If you want to be on time, you can't have it all. And this is where prioritization, if you like, is born out of. Now, I just want to do something which is quite convenient because we're going to run a poll, and which means Marie can actually go and have a sit down. But I just want to run a poll for you, and those that did the KRC webinar last time will know that there was a slight technical issue with the poll, and that's because there's something wrong with the GoToWebinar software. So first off, I just want to ask everyone on the webinar how many projects they think could be appropriate for a way of working in which the you can play with the actual scope. So there's a lot of projects, if you like, that sorry, it's all got to be there, but I find that it's quite rare. But in terms of what we're talking about here, what's your view on how many of these projects, in terms of your organisation, what percentage could you think you could play around with time and scope? Now, a third of you have voted already. And I'll close the poll pretty soon. And that's, I think, enough there. There's some very interesting things coming out here. So now what I'm going to do is show you the poll, and we get a lot of feedback from people saying that seeing how other people vote is actually quite interesting. And so I'm going to close the poll. And if this goes slightly wrong, just bear with me because it is something that's not quite working with their software. So if I get the poll up for you and share it with you, you can have a look and see what sort of figures we've got. So if you take a look at that there in terms of what the result in terms of what other people are seeing, there's quite a lot of people that see that, if you like, the majority of their projects there can be run this way. And quite a big percentage, 13%, are saying, all of them can be run that way. But there's very few, in fact only one, and bear in mind we've got hundreds of people on the webinar, only one that says it can't be done that way. But can you see that the majority, if you like, the critical mass of where the sort of scope-based projects are is very much in the the majority of what sort of projects are available. Now let me just see if I can click on that there. Now hopefully you'll come back to the screen that we've just been on. If I close that, so go for that. Now you might see the waiting room, but that will change in a moment. So what I want to do now is move on to the next slide, which is what is about prioritization in context. Now I know some of you might be seeing the waiting room at the moment, but that will clear, I believe, very shortly. I've put a bug request in to go to webinar, and let me just try something here. We're going to be back. Really sorry about this, but GoToWebinar are calling this actually a design feature. It's not quite the word I would have used. So let me explain the context of where prioritization works. So there's two sort of areas I want you to look at now in terms of where things work. And there's something called the product environment. And this is where you've already got an existing product, and you've got, if you like, a backlog and a list of things that you need to introduce to your product. In Scrum, this is called the backlog, and it could be a series of modifications, enhancements. And what you do is you prioritize these in order of importance, and you just put the most important at the top and the least important at the bottom. And the point of this level of prioritization is that really MoSCoW isn't brilliant in this sort of area, to be honest. If you've got a series of enhancements and they're 2 or 3 day pieces of work, it's very much sort of regular fries. You don't need to do anything too dramatic. You would then batch these up into 2 or 4 week sprints or time boxes, and this is very much what I call BAU, business as usual. It's routine work, they're enhancements, it's pretty simple. Now this isn't the same as what a project environment is. So if you look over onto the left hand side of the screen, just imagine you've got something quite complicated to do. Just imagine that there's a lot of unknowns. This is where you need to do quite a bit of upfront work, and this is where something like DSDM is extremely powerful. Built into DSDM is something called feasibility and foundations, which are a couple of phases you do at the beginning of a project to understand what it is you're trying to achieve. Now in these phases you'll be driving out requirements. Initially at the sort of feasibility stage they'll be high level, in foundations they're going to be at intermediate level, and later on they're going to be in a detailed level. Now this is where it's very powerful and very useful to have MoSCoW, as opposed to, if you like, the more simplistic view of Scrum where you've got an existing product. Now what then happens is, because it's complicated and it's a bit unusual, it needs to be managed. So you need a project manager, and you need a project manager who understands MoSCoW, and you also need governance, for example a steering committee or a project board, and they need to know what MoSCoW is as well, because it's quite possible we might drop things out of the project, and we don't want someone on a steering committee saying, well, I'm missing something and I'm not very happy about it. They need to understand what Agile is and what DSDM is. So the first big thing I want you to understand about prioritization is the context, is the position. If we have just got a product and we're just modifying it, there really is very little prioritization sort of thinking other than let's do the most important. But the big learning point is a project is complicated. It has dependencies, it has, if you like, groups of functionality. So if you have the ordering function and you have the payment function, you can't just sort of pick the most important ones and do them all at the same time. There's sequences and dependencies. And this is where MoSCoW comes in and pays, pays big dividends. And I'll explain a little bit more about that later as we go along. Now, just a quick graphic now as we go through simple MoSCoW to get everyone clear about what it is and some of the impacts. And the first thing I want you to see is the sort of 80-20 rule, or Pareto, and a sort of degree, if you like, of pragmatism. Now, in DSDM, we have something called the PRL, which stands for Prioritise Requirements List. Now, this is a list of requirements that have been prioritized, as you might expect. And what you do with every requirement is you categorize them depending on whether they are a must, meaning you must have it, a should, meaning you should have it, or a could, meaning you could have it. Now, as you start going through the project and you're playing around with things and things go a little bit wrong, a bit like a couple of things that have happened on this project already, you might de-scope things and drop things out to keep your eye on that deadline and to keep your quality threshold at the right level. So what you do is you drop things out as you go along. You de-scope. Maybe a few things. So if this is the original requirements list and we drop a couple of things out, and these become won'ts or won't have this time. Now it's very important to realize that these things are disappearing. They are going, and you need to be very careful with your customer and your business reps about why this is happening. Because one of the big tips I would give everyone on this webinar is that if you only get to this stage of the conversation, all people can see is some of my project's gone missing. What they don't see, or they might not understand, is by doing this, by delivering a bit less, you can hit the deadline, which has probably got a very big business imperative, and you can protect the quality. So things are well designed, well documented, and well tested. So you need to see the full picture when you're explaining this to people. But here's the most important bit about, in terms of the way prioritization and the variable scope works, is the fact that it's not all about losing things. Often on a project, in fact on every project, business people will change their mind. They will come up with new ideas. And this is where the MoSCoW prioritization technique can be very, very useful. Now I just want to try something with you now. You don't need to type anything in, maybe just write something on a piece of paper. But I'm looking for you to think of one word. So either think of one word that comes into your head or just write down the word on a piece of paper. But my question for you, or my scenario for you, is I want you to write down how you feel when the customer or your business reps come up to you and they say, I've changed my mind, I've got a new requirement. Now my bet is 80% of you have written something negative. And I would think half of that, from when I've done it before, I've actually written something rude. Now, the important point about MoSCoW and prioritization is this allows you to not see it as negative. It allows you some mechanisms to say, okay, you've changed your mind, maybe we're getting a more accurate solution, but we're going to ask 2 questions in return. So from now on, once you've heard this webinar, anytime anyone says, I've changed my mind, and you're using MoSCoW, quite simply say, that's great news, really pleased about it, we're going to get a more accurate solution, or do that in your own words in terms of what works for you. And then the 2 questions you're going to ask them are, what is it that you want us to trade out or remove from the PRL? And the second question you ask is, and what's the priority on the new requirements? Because working in a time-based way, in an Agile and DSDM way, quite simply, you can only get 6 months' work done in 6 months. So if you put another 10 days in because you've thought of something new, which is okay, something's got to come out. This is known as Archimedes' principle and the law of displacement. Now I've done this a lot, and I know some of you have written down, or the word that's come into your head was probably something like ka-ching or money. Now that's a fair enough comment, but remember, if the customer's changing their mind and you're charging them for extra requirements, it's not necessarily a good place for the customer to be in. And this thing about new requirements gives you the chance, if you like, to have the new requirements for free. But it's very much about trading. Now one of my favourite projects was working with the MOD. It was a £3 million project, and they called this the trading area. They called it a trading space. They just saw it as something that goes in and out, but they just knew, for 3 million, and this was sterling, they knew they had 1 year, 3 million sterling, and that was the finites. What was the variable were the requirements, which they'd MoSCOW'd, and they played in and out. And these changes, when they had new changes and changes to the requirements, were in effect free of charge. It was just a question of trading in and out. And if you can get your organization to see sort of playing with scope as a trading mechanism as opposed to what aren't we going to get, it's a lot more of a productive environment to be in. So let's be just clear on a few things there. If you're doing this properly, you'll only lose a little bit. Losing 5 or 10% of your project, maybe even a little more, isn't a disaster. If you're losing half of your project, that's something else has gone wrong. That normally means you're trying to do a 6-month project in 3 months, and that's a different issue to do with time boxing, and that's not really covered by prioritization. But you will fail quick if that situation is actually happening. But the key you need here, the magic ingredient, and it's not a walk-on part, you need customer and business involvement to drive this decision making. And the key word there is drive. It's very much a partnership. If you've got engineers and technical people and software developers working with the business, a lot of back and forth to say, well, we could drop that out. What about this? Actually, that one turns out to be quite easy. Could you drop this requirement out? That is how the conversation should go. But very importantly, it's business driven. The key reason for that is if you ask the technical people to prioritize, they will drop out the easy stuff. And that is not, they will drop out the difficult stuff. And that's not really the rationale that we want for delivering features to a system or some sort of final solution. Right, so let's now move away from the basics and get to some top tips really and some learning points. And some of these might be a bit controversial, and that's the way we try and sort of do things, certainly at KRC. We try to challenge a lot of the current thinking. And if we could move MoSCoW on a bit, I think you'll find some of this could be quite useful. So some really simple stuff to start with: must have, should have, could have. And I'm sure that when Di invented MoSCoW, I think it was something slightly different, would like to have, but whatever. But now the sort of official term in DSTM is won't have this time. But importantly, what do you mean by this time? Do you mean you won't have it in this time box, or you won't have it in this project? And you've got to be very clear and transparent to your customer and the business as what we mean by this time. Don't say it under your breath, but you've got to be very clear what this time actually means. Another top tip is that MoSCOWing relates to a deadline or a time. I see people who MoSCoW their issues list, for example. Now, you could say must fix it, should fix it, but really the whole of MoSCoW works to a time. If you haven't got a deadline, just prioritize it, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And this is why if you've got a whole shed load of modifications to an existing product, just prioritize it, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But on a project where you're hitting dependencies and deadlines, this is where you need time. MoSCoW without time, or MoSCoW without a deadline, in really simple terms, doesn't make any sense. Another point is the fact that what we talked about here is enabling flexing the requirements, enabling the on-time delivery, and helping you protect the quality is what I call the end point. Just don't prioritize. You've got to see this as a stepping stone to a greater place. Now, I know the most common question that I get, and I know that a lot of you are thinking here at the moment, is the classic question here, but hang on a minute, isn't everything a must? So if you get your business reps in a room or your customer and you go through the features, which of these are must, shoulds and coulds, you're going to find that there's a lot of musts. So again, a question for you. You don't need to type anything in. Just have a little think to yourself and see if you get this right. I know some of you have experienced and will, but how do you work out whether it really is a must? So have a little think about how you would find that out. And the clue I'd give you for those that may not know is you need to ask one question. Now, a few of you might be saying, yeah, why do you want it, and such like. But the killer question is actually, without it, it won't work. So I don't want any of it. And this is the question to ask to find out whether things are really a must. So if you take something like the bicycle there, without the front wheel, it just doesn't work. Now, somebody might say, will it work without the saddle? Well, it actually would. It might be a little bit tricky, but you could still use it if, say, the saddle was missing. What about the brakes even? You could still use it. Now, don't get me wrong, I don't mean to say, yeah, we only deliver the musts, and certainly a saddle would come under the heading should have, but a should is a should, and it's not a must. And the important thing about a should is that, and don't sort of decode it or try and give it some fancy rule about what a should is, it should be there. That's why it's called a should. But a must be there because it won't work. Now, your bells and whistles are down there in the coulds. So, killer question, without it, it won't work. What some people do is to say, would you go live? Would you ask the question on the day before you go live and say, look, this feature isn't there, do we still go live? Again, another nice acid test is to see whether it really is a must. Another thing you might want to try and find out about in terms of deciding whether it's a must is this idea of, well, is there another way? One project I worked on had a requirement that all the customers were saying it has to be a must, and they were going a bit over the top about it. So I quite simply said to them, well, how are you actually doing it at the moment? And they said, well, we're using Excel spreadsheets. And I said, well, could you do that after the project by any chance if we don't get it in? And they said, well, yeah, we could. Not particularly pleased about it, but they could. Bottom line is, it's not a must. Okay, it's a should, and we'd certainly like to get it done. So sometimes you can look at, well, there's a workaround, and you'd be amazed, even quite sophisticated projects, how much a manual process or a manual workaround can actually take a must down to a should. And this gives you the flexibility so that you can hit your deadlines. One of the biggest single things to do in terms of helping you with prioritization is something called granularity. If you can break things down, this is where you get your shoulds and coulds. Almost certainly at a high level, you're going to get a lot of musts. So if you've got just some initial requirements and you've only got 6, 7, 8 high-level project objectives, there's a good chance they're all musts. Now that doesn't mean it's a fixed scope project, it just means at the high level they're all musts. When you start to break things down and break those, if you like, big requirements down into intermediate level requirements, that's when you get the shoulds and coulds. A really simple example might be something like a searcher in say, IT. If you're searching for something, yeah, I've got to search for something, that just sounds absolutely, that's the way it's got to be. But how many ways and types of search might you want to have in terms of features? And this is where, well, it must search on name, must search on account number, but then you get a lot of other searches that are very much shoulds and coulds, and this is where your shoulds and coulds appear. But even with the Agile way of working, you'll get a lot of shoulds and coulds come out in the actual delivery when you're down there actually building things. If you're building a marketing campaign or building some software, when you actually get in there, you start to uncover more and more shoulds and coulds, and even how you solve the problem has got lots of shoulds and coulds. Only this week I'm in a room with someone and they're saying we could do it this way, that way, and the technical people are offering up 4 or 5 options, and it goes, well, it should do this, it could do it, as long as it does this, it must do this, and I don't mind if you do it that way. And there's a lot of give and take, which enables them to hit the deadline. One concept we have at KRC is something called boulders, rocks and gravel. And if you can take your requirements from being very big things like boulders, break them down into rocks, and then break them down into gravel, this is where you get this, this thing called granularity. Now some of our customers use all different systems like what is it, rocks, pebbles and sand. I really don't mind which one. It does confuse the hell out of us when we turn up at the wrong customer saying the wrong thing. But this idea of breaking it down, granularize things is the way to get a lot of shoulds and coulds, and the shoulds and coulds get you into the you know, this gets you into being able to hit the deadline and protect things. Just remember, as the Agile guru MC Hammer said, break it down. Now, MoSCoW in the real world, because one of the criticisms I get is, yeah, but don't you just do the most important thing first? And the answer to that is no, not on a complicated project. You might if it's just a bunch of amendments, yeah, you might, but an example I would give you is something like building a house. Would you start with the roof? Because that's probably the most important thing of a house, is the roof. But you don't start with it. You've got dependencies. You need to build the foundations, the walls. You then need to build the roof. But the roof is a must-have, but you just don't start with it. So in terms of sort of MoSCoW in the real world, the first thing to bear in mind is that we've actually got dependencies and we've got groupings that happen. So requirements don't exist in isolation. They're not just 100 random things that don't relate to each other, which may be the case if you've got a Scrum backlog on an existing product. But if you've got an ordering system, a payment system, then some reporting, there's groupings. There's the payment stuff. There's the ordering stuff, and there's also dependencies. You can't actually pay for it till you've ordered it. So this is where MoSCoW comes in. Again, with the boulders, rocks and gravel and the dependencies, you can find yourself in a very powerful situation. Now on the screen there you can see the word sort of functional and non-functional. It might be that you need to, I don't know, a credit card payment needs to be processed, and that's a must-have. It's just that sometimes you can MoSCoW the non-functional side, and maybe it's processed in 10 seconds, should be processed in 5, could be processed in 3 seconds. So there's lots of dependencies and trade-offs, and with the functional and non-functional side, there's a lot of stuff going on. And this is where MoSCoW comes in, and if you plan and work out how your project looks and use this form of prioritization, it's really quite powerful and really neat. This is where 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 isn't going to work. If you turn up at a building site and go, right, number 1 priority is the roof, it's just not going to work. Now there's another concept which I may lose some of you on the webinar. I don't mean you're going to quit the webinar, but I mean this one is a little bit difficult. So please, if you don't quite get this, don't worry. But there's something called inheritance, and this is where you have a requirement which has got, if you like, a MoSCoW inside it. So for example, you could have a could-have requirement that has a must inside it. Now, when you boil this down to how you would manage the project and de-scoping, in effect, it is a could-have. So I know there's a must in it, and I'm saying musts must be delivered, but if the must is inside a could, it's the higher up value in terms of the MoSCoW that gets the priority. So if you take the picture on the screen there, which is a big biro, the actual ink refill in the middle is probably well, sorry, you won't be able to write without it, so let's call it a must. But the plastic barrel around the ink refill, it will work without it. I think if you turned up on one of our training courses and we gave you an ink refill, it's not going to look impressive. But with the barrel, which is a should, and with the ink refill, maybe people wouldn't notice any difference. Maybe people wouldn't go, hey, where's the top? Maybe they're not expecting a top. But again, the top is, if you like, the cherry on the cake, and if we've got time on the project, let's stick the top on. But the top is very much a could-have. But again, another question for you, if you're enjoying these questions on your lunch break, those in the UK anyway. Anybody know what's in the top of a top on a pen? Now, if you look very closely, you can see there's actually a hole. And I've heard about 8 different reasons why there's a hole, but the actual truth about why there's a hole in the top of a pen is because it's a choking hazard. Well, it's not a choking hazard, it's to help prevent choking if, say, somebody happened to swallow it. Now, if you're delivering the top, it's basically a health and safety issue, and therefore, if you're delivering a big biro that is compliant to certain standards, you'd have to have the hole in the top. So can you see that the hole is a must if you're delivering the top, but the top is actually a could. So when you're talking to anyone on a project, always have a big biro with you. It's quite useful. So what I'm saying here is the old 1, 2, 3, put it in an order of a backlog like a shopping list, it's not going to work in project situations. And this is why MoSCoW is extremely powerful. And this is why I said the slide earlier about context. There's the project world and there's the enhancement world. And to be straight with you, in the enhancement world, I'd probably use 1, 2, 3, N. But in the project world, I would primarily use this. There might be times I use 1, 2, 3, but primarily I go down the MoSCoW route. And this is why we always get, raise a few eyebrows or people get really confused. This is actually why you deliver a could sometimes before a must. So it might be that something in the ordering system is, nice to have and we're ahead of scheduled and we delivered it, but actually the payment thing coming later is a must. So honestly, you will deliver coulds before musts. Because another I don't know whether it's instinct or a knee-jerk reaction, I'm not sure, but don't you do all the musts first? And the answer is no. And that's to do, again, with those top 2 or 3 points there because of functional groupings and dependencies and things like inheritance. Now, one of the most common questions I get, and if you could actually do this while you're watching the webinar, you don't have to, but there's a reason for it, and that is one of the most common questions I get about MoSCoW concerns what's called the 60-20-20 rule. Now, the reason why I've got you to sort of wag your thumbs there is it is actually just a guide. It's a rule of thumb. It is not a law. It is just a piece of guidance, and it's a good bit of guidance as well. The most important figure is that 60 figure, because you're trying to make sure that those musts that you've identified that must be there are 60% or less in terms of effort. Now that word's in bold because it's very important. Again, you get a lot of calls and questions about whether it's number of, no, it's effort. If 60% of your effort is must-have or less, you're in a good place. You've in effect got 40% contingency. So that 60 is a very important figure, because this is giving you what's called the minimum usable subset, and that's not a typo on there. The last T in subset makes it spell the word must, and this is what you absolutely have to have. Now, a quick piece of advice for you, and the reason why I keep doing this with the thumb is a very common question we get is, I haven't got 60-20-20. I've got 50% musts. What do I do? And there's often a desire to go and find another 10% of must-haves. You know, don't do that. Just if you've got 50% musts, you're in a good place. Don't do anything at all. Equally, if you've got a break of say 60-30-10, again, don't do anything. Don't contrive any of your priorities. You may want to challenge it and make sure that you have got 30% shoulds. You know, by all means check that, but don't contrive and take, you know, a third of those shoulds and turn them into coulds just to get to a 60-20-20. The priority is the priority. You just play the actual breakdown as you find it. But you are guaranteeing in effect the must-haves. You are saying we can get something that works, and that's why the, if you like, the minimum usable subset is often seen as guaranteed. Now, if you're moving over 60%, you know, 65, 70, 75%, it gets very, very tricky, because really you can't guarantee the deadline, and you'd need to shift to the other triangle, because in effect you're dealing with something where the scope is too much in terms of being fixed. Now, some of you may know other terms like MVP, minimum viable product, and you also might know MMFS, which is minimum marketable feature set. A little bit difficult to say at times. But what I always try to say to customers is, if you can deliver all the musts and shoulds, you know, great, and try to get through as many of the coulds as you can. So, for example, if you had a 60-20-20 split, you did all the musts, all the shoulds, and you did half the coulds, and you hit the deadline, and the quality's good, that's a really good project. Whatever you do, don't go around sort of you know, sobbing uncontrollably because 10% of my project's missing. Deadline and quality are the big things. Certainly in 2014, these are the big ticket items. Now, in terms of prioritisation levels, I just want to quickly do a couple of things, and then we'll get through to the questions. But another question I get a lot is about different levels of MoSCoW prioritisation, and this is really quite powerful and a nice little trick that goes very well with your customer. Because if you just read what it says on the screen there, the priority for the project may be different to that of the increment or time box. And what I'm trying to say by that is, you may have a project level must. So let's say requirement 55 is a must for the project. Let's say that project there is 3 months long. And you might try to deliver that requirement in the first increment or first time box or first sprint, whatever you want to call it. So let's say that first increment there was a month long. You might try to deliver it in that first increment. But what you would do is load it into that increment. So, for example, if you're having, you know, you're trying to do ordering and payment in that first increment, and you think you can do reporting as well. Now, reporting is a must for the whole project, but I'm going to try and get it into that first delivery. Then load it into that first delivery, but load it as a could have. But the key word is a could have for the increment. It's still a must at the top level for the project. Now, it might be that increment goes a little bit, you know, late and you struggle. So what would happen is you would then drop it out of that increment. You would de-scope it. So in other words, you're saying to that could, you won't have it this time. But the this time is to do with that increment 1. It's not to do with the project. So maybe that could have goes into the second increment or second time box, where it might be a must for that time box. But importantly, it's not in 2 time boxes. It just disappears out of that first one. So these different levels, and again, I might have confused some of you, but you know, maybe just revisit it again. It's quite a powerful technique, and it's really good to say to a customer, I think we can get this in time, but I'm not guaranteeing it. You know, if we get everything right on this increment, yeah, you'll get it. But if we get a little bit of some tricky stuff or some new stuff, hey, we're going to bounce it. But they will get it by the end of the project, or the whole thing won't work. So that's prioritisation levels, and just a few final tips for you in terms of where we're going with sort of what I call advanced prioritisation. And this one I find quite interesting. I find even very experienced DSDMers and people using MoSCoW seem to think that size and complexity has something to do with the priority. Well, it doesn't. It doesn't matter whether it's the hardest thing to build or easy. It's either a must, a should, or a could. So remove size and complexity from the actual equation. It doesn't matter. MoSCoW in non-functionals is really good. Performance, like I said earlier, we did some great work with the MOD, and there was things that needed to operate in certain temperatures. So, you know, must work at 0 degrees, should work at -10, could work at -20. It gives the supplier some room for manoeuvre, and MoSCoW in non-functionals is pretty powerful. Understanding things like bloat is important. This is why we're prioritizing, because bloat, you know, adding too many features and features that we don't use is just standard. So, you know, just drop them out. We don't need them. The Americans often refer to something called YAGNI. You ain't going to need it. Quick question for you. How many programs do you use on your washing machine? Now, if anyone says more than 2, that's quite advanced. If you're saying words like 4, 5, or 6, that is mega. But most people say 1 or 2. Some people say 0, but I think that's a different issue. Now, if you think about how many features are on a washing machine, there's literally thousands if you do all the combinations. So this idea of understanding that actually, do we want it all? No, we don't. We'd rather get most of it in by the deadline and well built. Change is going to happen, so don't be resistant to it, and again, see it as trading. And the final tip I'd give you before we just go on to a couple of info slides and then the questions, is that if you really are sort of confused about, is it a should, is it a could, is it a could, is it a should, just call it a should could and move on. S/C, just call it a should could. But having said that that tip is okay by me anyway and works, there's no such thing as a must should. You need to work out which side of the divide those fall. So, one very quick info slide from KRC, and then I'll get you to Emily to work through some stuff for you. But if you're looking at some downloads, we've got something here called the Streetwise MoSCoW Guide. If you go onto the agilekrc.com website under downloads, you can pull down a Streetwise MoSCoW Guide, which is 8 pages, and you're just seeing one of them there. And I'm very pleased to say we've got somebody drawing a graphic of this webinar. It's a guy called Stuart Young, who I find very impressive, and he's going to create a one-sheet color A4 graphic of this webinar, which you'll be able to download from our site as well. And I think we're going to get you to get that sent out to everyone who's attending anyway via DSDM. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to mute myself and start looking at some questions. So get your questions coming in now, and I'll see how many I can get through. So type those into your question box, and I'm just going to get Emily to read through the next slide and a few pointers. So I'll be back in a minute to take your questions. So Emily, I'm going to hand back to you now and mute myself.
Can you hear me now? Yes. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so for further information, you can visit www.dsdm.org or contact us with any questions at info@dsdm.org or the following phone number, +44 01233 611162. So thanks, Keith. That was great. And with regarding the washing machine, definitely use just the one. The one program. So today's slides and webinar will be available to download on the DSDM website in the webinar library. So if you just go to the Dig Deeper tab, and you should be able to download it after the webinar. This year, DSDM celebrates its 20th birthday with the launch of the revised DSDM Agile Project Framework. For more information on attending the launch, you can visit our homepage. You will find the link to register in the blue box labelled 20th Anniversary and Launch. You can become a DSDM member from as little as £50 a year. DSDM membership provides members with the opportunity to learn at a discounted rate whilst developing skills, networking with others and sharing agile experiences. If you have any further questions or interested in getting more involved, please contact us, or you can follow and tweet about us at DSDM. Now back over to you, Keith, who will hopefully be able to answer your MoSCoW prioritisation questions.
Brilliant, Emily. Thank you very much. The questions are coming through. We have, I don't know, about 30 or 40 questions. I'll get through as many as I can, and after the webinar, what I'll do is get answers to all of them. But I'm going to try and get through as many as I possibly can. And Emily, if you tick them off, if I actually get any that are done here. So, great. First question here. In fact, which I've just managed to lose, actually from, oh, I'll skip that, I've actually lost it. No, it's there, it's from Di. Thanks very much for asking the question, Di, and he says, by the way, W always meant won't have, i.e. not this time. So I'm glad things haven't moved on, and great to have you on the webinar there, Di. Question from Julian here about budget. You talk about MoSCoW against time, but can it also be applied against budget, where budget is more of a limitation than time? The short answer is yes, and what this is sometimes called, instead of time boxing, it's called cost boxing. There's a very close relationship between time and cost. 4 weeks work is 4 weeks money. The only slight concern I've got about that is throwing money at the problem, throwing resources at the problem, and you end up with a 20–30% overrun. So the short answer is yes, but my strong advice to you is keep it focused on the time. I've got something here saying, hi Keith, great webinar. Did I understand correctly, this is from Joe, that if you plan to drop an S or a C, you should consciously change it to a W in your records, i.e. on the PRL? Again, short answer to that, I would say yes. You might be able to move it to a different, it depends whether you've got a board on the wall, you might be able to move it across to something else. But I think using things like a W is really visible. It's saying you won't be getting it. This is now a W. But again, what am I talking about here? Is this on this particular drop, or are we talking something a bit wider like the actual project? A question from Pavel. How frequently do you recommend to do the review of the prioritization, in a particular when you've got 300 requirements in a project or release backlog? I believe that prioritization is very dynamic. I would just keep it going regularly. There's standard ideas of what's called 10% time, or half a day a week should be spent looking after things like your prioritization. But the key thing is to make it dynamic, frequent. And so just a simple metric there in terms of I might make sure I'm spending half a day. I might take Tuesday off to really look through the priorities. But sometimes you can actually just wing it and just work in a very interactive way, and when you get a problem, hey, we need to rejig a few things here. But it is a dynamic type of situation, so just keep it moving, keep it dynamic. I think the word D in DSDM stands for dynamic, and that is actually why. Question from Tolu: at what point do you draw the line under the level of granularity you get into? I hesitate slightly to be very prescriptive, but I would say 3 is quite a good number. It might be you just break things down once and you could work at maybe 2 levels, boulders and rocks, and that's all you need. I think if you went to a 3rd level, you covered just about every option. And I've worked on stuff from whatever, nuclear submarines to whatever, and I don't find you need a 4th and a 5th level of granularity. Normally that happens as if you're running, I don't know, 2,000 requirements as a project, when really it should be about 4 or 5 projects. Can I trade out, something from Tim here, can I trade out a could and replace it with a must? The answer to that is yes. Requirements change, understanding changes, things come in, things go out. The only thing I would say on that one, Tim, no, is that's not ideal, because it might be that the must percentage is creeping up. If you're already at 60% musts, we're starting to take on a little bit of damage there, and therefore that's not the ideal thing. Finding musts late on is not fun, and it's not good. And a lot of people come up to me and say, hey, what do I do? What do I do if I get a last-minute must? And the answer is, you're in trouble. There's no magic wand. You just, all hands on deck and sort it out. But if you've had a good way of working and you've been using things like DSTM and interactive workshops, whatever, where on earth did the must come from? Where did that last minute must come from? You know, it shouldn't happen. It does happen, but it shouldn't. But sometimes you've got to just take your medicine. Got a question here from Dusty talking about, can MoSCoW work in fixed price engagements? Absolutely yes. I was only dealing with a procurement department yesterday afternoon. We're talking about exactly this, and therefore you can go to your supplier and say, look, it must do this, it should do this, and these are the could-haves. You know, how much of that am I going to get? And somebody can sit there and say, all right, for £1 million, we think we can deliver it all. But bear in mind, if we're 10% out, you're going to lose half of those coulds. Now, whether you link it to the business case is another level, and that's quite complex. You could have what are called best case, you could have worst case, and expected case. Now, whether you hard link those to the MoSCoWs, I would advise not, because it can get a little bit more complicated. But this idea of fixed price with MoSCoW is absolutely fine, and the reason is it's your MoSCOWing is creating your contingency. It might be another time, another place, time and money a contingency, but that's a different triangle, and that is why this way of working uses MoSCoW. And remember, we're trying to get to this end point. Now, in terms of some other things here, what we got here? I've got something from Roger here. Any advice or tip on the number of items in the list, e.g. working with 5 musts or working with 50? Now, I quite like that question because I do try to give people some sort of guide, and I'm going to give you some numbers. Please don't take them as being factual numbers and then you go off and write them in stone. So, to me, in the early stage of a project, when you're dealing with the boulders, you might be in feasibility or project startup, I'd expect you to have less than 10 high-level objectives or big fat requirements, and they could all be musts. What I would then do is to get you breaking it down into, if you're doing prints and you're creating the PID, or you're doing foundations in DSTM, I would then get you to break it down so you can count them in sort of tens. I've got 20, 30, 50, 80, but what I'm saying now is less than 100 and more than 10. That's what I call intermediate requirements. And then when you go down into the gravel and the detail, yeah, we're talking 100, 200, 300, 500. But again, I keep rolling into a customer. A couple of weeks ago, they won some work from a big government organisation, big list of 300 requirements, and that was the starting point. But that's not a cool way of working. Start at the high level, break it down to, as I say, 30, 40, 50 requirements. And please don't quote me on the exact number, but certainly I'd say less than 100, more than 10 for that intermediate stage. And that actually is where you suddenly start to get a lot of your MoSCoW in terms of the power, in terms of your shoulds and coulds. Now I'm just going to take another minute or so, and we'll finish around about 25 past. That's UK time. What we got here? A good question here from Prakash. It says, what is the percentage of must, shoulds, coulds that we consider during an iteration? Now earlier I was saying if you get a project and you get your list of requirements, then they break down how they break down. You look at the effort. So over a whole project, if it's 60-20-20, that would be nice. But if it's 50-30-20, you play with the cards you get dealt. Now, when you're loading up your iterations or increments or time boxes, then loading them 60-20-20, because remember, these are now lower down in terms of granularity. I think you'll find that a pretty good guide, 60-20-20. But again, I stress the word is effort. It's not sort of number of. Okay. Have we got anything here? Martin's asked me a question. How do you handle shoulds becoming musts as the stakeholders change their minds? With great care and great patience. Why did it happen? Why are we getting these surprises? And the biggest sort of tip I can give you there really is that I would find out why it's happening. Is it baggage? Is it sort of emotional, or is it other people coming in, or people made the decisions who weren't empowered? Try and find why a should goes to a must. Why wasn't it a must in the first place? Just remember the classic thing I often see, which I call release 2 syndrome, is when you've de-scoped a few requirements and you've said to the customer, yeah, you'll get that in release 2, and oh no, we're only just de-scoping it from this one. If release 2 never happens, they do tend to come back a little bit more abrasive or more confident to say, sorry mate, it's a must. And as I say, that they're not too keen on that one. Okay. Right. I'll tell you what I'm going to do now. I'm going to finish, and I think I might have got through about 15% of the questions, but rest assured I'll get an answer to all of them, and we'll email it out via Emily. I would like to say thank you very much for all those who've attended, and it's been great having you. We've had some technical fun and games, but that's all part of the life. You know, projects have those sort of things. So hope you have a great weekend. I'm a Formula 1 fan, so I'm really looking forward to my Spanish Grand Prix. So all that remains for me to say is thanks for joining the webinar, and goodbye for now.